Abdirak finished his morning prayers before returning to his tent to dress for the day. He lifted a small shard of mirror from his pack and began to trim his hair the way he usually did, before it had grown to its terminal length. He gazed at himself in the cloudy mirror as he worked, his face woefully unmarked by the scars that had once been. His eyes fell to his lips, and he felt an ache in his heart. The scar had been a small one compared to many of the others that had graced his features for so many years. It had stretched down from his lower lip towards his chin, and had been one that he had held particularly dear. He set his razor aside for a moment and traced a finger over where the scar had been, the movement familiar and practiced. He knew that scar better than many others, and he'd been well acquainted with each. He did not doubt his skill and ability in replicating it, but doing so would not fully restore its meaning. He had been a young man, though his studiousness and devotion to Loviatar had awarded him the status of whiplawer especially early, traveling from Calant to Westgate. He had been put on an errand for the high whip mistress of the House of Scarlet Hooks, delivering a package, the content of which he did not know, to Painbliss Hall. He didn't carry much with him on the journey, though he'd had a small package tucked under one arm and a near-empty pack slung over his back. He kept enough gold with him to afford himself some room and board in the more dangerous places along the route, and had just set out from Archenbridge early that morning. He'd had a horse for much of the nearly 600-mile journey, purchased for cheap from a farmer in Harrowdale. He did not have the knowledge or ability to care for the exhausted creature further, and so had sold the horse in the previous night in Archenbridge, using the money to replenish his sparse supplies, have his clothing washed, and have a little extra in pocket to afford the fare to make the final journey across the Dragonmere from Ermlaspur to Westgate in about 2 days' time. When he'd heard the men shouting at him on the road up ahead, and then from behind as well, though, he'd wished that he had held on to the beast a little longer. He'd handed over his valuables at knife point, though the sight of the blade was of little consequence to him. They took gold, his overcoat, tools, which were brazenly thrown onto the ground when being inspected by the thieves, what little jewelry he wore in the form of a small brooch bearing the symbol of his goddess, and even his leather shoes. When they demanded the package that he had not released for a moment, Abdirak had refused and tried to flee back up the road toward the city. He could just see the walls in the distance. They had caught him easily. They must have been locals, where he had walked nearly a 10-day with little more than what he needed to survive the journey. They had wrenched the package from his grasp and pushed him off of the road and into some shrubbery, taunting and leering at him. One man had held him in place while another slid a long blade between his ribs and into one of his lungs. They had told him, as he lay gasping, that usually they would beat marks who tried to run, but he would just like it too much. Then they'd left him on the roadside, just out of sight of the path, to die. He had been focusing fully on completing the mission that the whip mistress had sent him on, understanding service to her to, by extension, be service to their goddess. But his haste had led him to become lax in his morning prayers for many days, and his magic, gifted to him by her glory, had waned. He had misattributed his devotion, and it would cost him his life as he was unable to heal himself in that dire moment. Abdirak had laid there by the road, concealed by the shrubbery, gasping each breath for what felt like a long time. He had closed his eyes and let the pain consume him, not hiding any groan of agony or gurgle as fluid filled his lungs from her. He didn't know how long he laid dying, but he was content, joyful even, in the knowledge that she would claim him soon. "Gods!" A woman's voice had startled him, and a hand pressed hard onto the wound in his chest. He had screamed from the pain, but laid still, his mind not entirely present as the unknown woman continued to apply pressure. He had heard her muttering to herself, but could not make out the words. His pain began to fade, and he heard her words halting as she panted. When Abdirak was able to open his eyes and focus on the stranger, the first thing he saw was a patch, hand-sewn to her top above her left breast, bearing a pair of white hands bound in red. The symbol of Ilmater. His breath had caught, his own blood aching as it threatened to drown him. The sharp pain made him scream again, which he turned into screaming at the woman to leave him alone. "Get out of here," he had hissed at her, spitting blood as he spoke. Every breath, even the wordless ones, was exhausting, and his head swam again from pain and breathlessness. "I'm a cleric," she had said soothingly. Her hand remained in place over his wound, while her other hand had brushed the hair out of his face in a friendly, almost maternal manner. "Just remain calm." He had pushed her hand away from his hair and grasped the wrist that pressed to his wound, stopping the blood from watering the soil and filling his lungs. Her hand was soaked in his blood, sticking their fingers together as he weakly wrestled her. "Go on! Run away, now!" She had glanced around, her eyes wide, perhaps believing that his warning was that those who had attacked him were still around, putting her in danger. And she was. An ancient, cosmic hatred seared in his soul, and his being surged with power from his goddess. Loviatar did not feel hatred any more than she did love, but she compelled it in him. He had clenched his jaw against the agony of the blazing heat in his chest, surrounding his soul in a passionate fire as the woman pressed her open palm over his wound again and spoke words of healing. She prayed to Ilmater to heal him, to relieve him of his anguish. She had prayed to the crying god to take his suffering and give it to her to bear on his behalf. The intent behind her words had made him nauseous, and the blood that filled his lungs and that which he swallowed down into his stomach had been no help to the sensation. Still, against his will, his body began to heal, and the cleansing pain had ebbed, forcing him to focus on the burning loathing that compelled his soul. She had pulled him upright, supporting his weight on an arm. She had pulled a canteen from her hip and unstopped it with her teeth before holding it up to his lips. He had drunk heartily, washing the metallic flavor of his own blood from his mouth. "There, child," she cooed as he drank, her hand still pressing over the rapidly healing, blood-soaked wound in his abdomen. She had been sweating profusely from the pain, dampening her soft brown hair that she wore pulled back, her features scrunched taut as she resisted screaming. "There is no Ilmatari house in Archenbridge, but I can bring you to a Chantian priest in the city." She had begun to help him to his feet, but Abdirak had pushed her away. As his strength returned to him, his entire being ached to act in accordance to her will. "Get away from me," he had growled at her. "Pain can often make one irritable," she had said, her tone light and understanding, and yet she did not understand. "It's no matter, child. Let me help you." She had pulled him to his feet despite his resistance. Abdirak had struck out at her with a fist, hitting her in the shoulder, though he was still so weak. "Go. By Loviatar's grace, I will be fine." Her eyes had widened in understanding. She had pulled a blade from her belt, holding it out in front of her in self-defense. She slashed at him when he struck out at her again, taking a few steps back. She had slashed across his face, and Abdirak had cried out in pain, but unlike others, he did not flee at the sensation. Now she wanted to run, but Abdirak could not allow her to. Loviatar demanded his action. Abdirak had lunged for her. She was not familiar with using a knife, clearly, as she punched him with her knife-wielding fist rather than stab at him. Or she did not want to harm him still. He had clasped a hand around her wrist and pulled her close, calmly speaking, "More. Die." She had frozen in place and her skin grew black as the necrosis spread rapidly from where his palm met her flesh. He had used all the strength he had to cast the spell, and so she fell to the ground, dead before her body stilled. His goddess demanded pain, but he had offered her as much mercy as he could afford in her swift demise. Abdirak had fallen to his knees beside her rapidly decomposing corpse, panting, now with both lungs, as fatigue racked his muscles. There he had stayed as he prayed to his goddess and begged for forgiveness for the mercy he had shown the Ilmatari, thanking her for the magic and strength she'd granted so that he could enact her will. He had flicked his tongue over his lip, to catch his sweat, and had felt a strong split separating his skin all the way down to the roots of his teeth. He had pushed his tongue through the split as he pulled off his blood-soaked tunic, folded it so the blood would not touch her, and laid it over her face in reverence for the dead. Then he had turned and forced his feet forward onto Westgate. He would always carry her memory in the scars she'd left. It was not for him to decide when and on whom to enforce it, but his goddess's will was paramount. Still, though Ilmatari, she had saved his life and, as a man, Loviatar or not, he would be ever grateful. Abdirak, now much older and wizened, though his unmarked face did not reflect such, lifted his sharp, needle-like blade to his face where the lowest part of the scar had been, and pressed until the blade kissed his teeth.